a comment on how Nehru saw his role in taking the historical process forward. The lessons he learned from Indian history of the acceptance of the existence of multiple truths, of a non-violent dialogical tradition, of negotiating of truth claims and conflict, and arriving at a higher level of synthesis were greatly strengthened by his increasingly deeper understanding of Mahatma Gandhi and Gandhiji's practice. This involved a change in his own Marxist understanding, which he had argued till the mid-1930s, as seen in his autobiography, towards a more complex Gramscian Marxian understanding of how change was to be negotiated, which is reflected in his later writing, The Discovery of India. This shift in Nehru has been seen by many as Nehru's contradictory, vacillating nature, his total dependence and subservience to Gandhiji, his giving in to vested interest, and so on. We do not agree with that. In an insightful work, Manas Firak Bhattacharya sees Nehru's doubts, his ambivalence, his openness, his engagement with apparently contradictory positions, not as his weakness, but as his strength. He is correctly critical of people like Partha Chatterjee, who dismiss Nehru's absolutely outstanding work, The Discovery of India, as a book of rambling, bristling with the most obvious contradictions. Or other scholars, such as the Eurocentric Marxist Perry Anderson, who shockingly rubbishes Nehru's Discovery of India as a steam bath of Schwarmerei with a Barbara Cartland streak, if you can believe this. This is in his book, The Idea of India. The Indian Ideology. As Bhattacharya argues, the idea of liberty needs to be reconciled with the presence of contradictions. No idea or truth claim can justify the sacrifice of human lives. It would mean the barbarism of truth. Ethics provides us to think of freedom without violence. Nehru did not sit on a horseback with sword in one hand and rush towards the wilderness of history, thinking they were giants he had to exterminate. He did not hallucinate from the desire to rid the world of all its ills and create a gigantic prison in the name of paradise. This is where Nehru learned from Gandhiji. He accepted Gandhiji's position that however good the end, the means had to be ethical and non-violent. For Gandhiji, his deep conviction on non-violence did not emerge from the fact that it was a brilliant tactic to fight the British, which of course it was, but from his philosophical position that nobody could make the claim of having arrived at transcendental truth or absolute truth. His belief in the possibility of multiple truths and multiple paths to the seeking of truth would not allow for violence against anyone. The Enlightenment project emerging from Europe often faltered on this ground, where the notions of possessing the ultimate truth justified mass killings by revolutionary movements in the name of democracy and the people, thus negating a critical aspect of democracy itself, that is, every human being's right to differ. Gandhiji saw this weakness in the French and the Russian Revolution as compared to the India's struggle for freedom. Attention must be drawn here to Tad Fernie's work, where he compares the European Enlightenment project with the Indian, Turkish, and Iranian efforts at transition to modernity, with a focus on the Indian national movement under Gandhiji's leadership, with its, what he calls, the ethic of reconciliation as mass movement, as well as the Nehruvian effort after independence, which he calls the ethic of reconciliation in nation-making. His conclusion is that the Indian experiment at transition to modernity without violence remained much truer to the Enlightenment objectives than what were achieved or tried to be achieved in Europe. Bhattacharjee has done us a favor by quoting extensively from Octavio Paz. Octavio Paz, the great Mexican poet, thinker, diplomat, Nobel laureate, who was also the Mexican ambassador to India in Nehru's time, showing how he very sensitively comprehended what Nehru had discovered for himself from Indian tradition and Gandhiji, and how, very importantly, he brilliantly interpreted Nehru and his supposed contradiction. It is well worth repeating them here, if for no other reason but to show how great contemporaries of Nehru saw him in contrast to scholars whom I would characterize as Eurocentric, if not colonial, and of course, the communal fake nationalists in India. In a speech delivered in 1966, this is what Octavio Paz says. It is remarkable that Nehru, in spite of his mainly being a political leader, did not fall into the temptation of suppressing the contradictions of history by brute force or with a verbal sleight of hand. It is unique in our world of fanatical Menicians, that is, those who see things only in black and white, and hangmen masked as philosophers of history. He did not pretend to embody either the supreme good or the absolute truth, but human liberty, man and his contradictions. He was faithful to his contradiction, and for this very reason, he neither killed others nor mutilated himself. In contrast to the majority of the political leaders of this century, Octavio Paz says, Nehru did not believe that he had the key to history in his hand. Because of this, he did not stain his country nor the world with blood. I mean, do remember that perhaps the Indian Revolution is the only revolution which was not followed by civil war. The entire period of transition from colonialism to post-colonial modernity occurs under the Nehruvian consensus. There is no mass killing of any kind from either side. Nehru tried to move forward towards his goal, what he thought was his historic role, with this sensibility. This meant following a path which could be slower, but it took people along and did not resort to violence and brute force, as many of his contemporaries trying the same transformation did in other parts of the world after being liberated from colonialism. We may ask ourselves the question that if Nehru was indeed as incompetent and evil as he's being described by certain forces, why the Mahatma chose him as his successor and not his other brilliant comrades like Raja Gopalachari and Sardar Patel. In a speech at the AICC on 15 June 1942, as early as that, Gandhiji said the following. Somebody suggested that Pandit Jawaharlal and I were estranged. This is baseless. Again, using imagery that only Gandhi could. He says, you cannot divide water by repeatedly striking it with a stick. It is important to mention this because, as you know, these days, the effort is to constantly divide our national movement. Nehru versus Bose, Gandhi versus Patel, Patel versus Nehru, Bhagat Singh versus Gandhi. I mean, there is as if the national movement was only fighting each other rather than the British. So Gandhi says you cannot divide water by repeatedly striking it with a stick. It is just as difficult to divide us. I've always said that not Rajaji, not Sardar Vallabhbhai, but Jawahar will be my successor. When I am gone, he will speak my language too. Even if this does not happen, I would at least die with this faith. Why did Gandhiji have such tremendous faith in Nehru? One can surmise only two reasons, and I will briefly mention that. First, Nehru quintessentially represented and fought for what Rabindranath Tagore called the idea of India. And what was it? The idea of India, in brief, as I see it, is 5 core values. First, sovereignty, that is, India will be independent and self-reliant and oppose imperialism, imperialist domination globally. 2, democracy, that is, India will be a democratic country with adult franchise, with equal rights to all citizens, irrespective of their caste, class, language, gender, region, or ethnicity. 3, secularism, that is, people belonging to different religious faiths will have equal rights in the country. India will not be a majoritarian Hindu state. Nehru and Gandhi repeatedly say that the future India is not going to be a Hindu Rashtra. Secularism and democracy were seen as coterminous. One could not exist without the other. The term secular democracy was often used conjointly, just as communalism was joined with loyalism. Secular democracy and communal loyalism. The 4th item and idea of India was a pro-poor orientation. Beginning with the early nationalists like Dadabhai Naoroji, whose book was titled Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, to Gandhiji, turning the face of the country towards the poor, the Daridra Narayan, to the revolutionaries, socialists and communists, all were agreed on a pro-poor orientation, even if there was no consensus on whether India was going to be socialist or a communist country. Lastly, the 5th idea was that India shall have a modern scientific outlook, which was to be propagated. Nehru called it the scientific temper, that is, overcoming obscurantism and blind faith. It must be noted that there was a consensus among the entire spectrum of the Indian national movement on these 5 core values. That is why it is called the idea of India. Entire national movement, from the moderates, Naoroji, Rana De, Gokhale, to Tilak, Siardas, to Bhagat Singh, to Gandhiji, Nehru, Patel, Bose, Acharya Narendra Dev, the socialists, JP, communist, EMS, Harkishan Singh Surjit, PC Joshi. Just think of any nationalist in this period. Across the spectrum, they agreed on these 5 core values. The only people who did not were the loyalists and the communalists, who now are masquerading as the nationalists. Not only did Nehru fight for these values during the freedom struggle, but he played a stellar role in implementing these ideas in the newborn state after independence. Gandhiji perhaps anticipated this capacity of Nehru in choosing him as his successor. In fact, the burden of implementing these ideas fell largely on Nehru's shoulders, with the Mahatma being murdered by a Hindu communalists within 6 months of India gaining independence, and Sardar Patel passing away in 1950. Nehru performed this task with great elan and imagination as India's first Prime Minister for about 17 years. It is on Nehru's role after independence in implementing the 5 core values of the idea of India that my address is focused. It is necessary to do so because today, as we will see very briefly, each one of this idea of India is deeply threatened. When we evaluate Nehru implementing the idea of India after independence, we must remind ourselves of what economists call the initial conditions from which we had to start, to get an idea of the gigantic task ahead of him at independence. The poet Rabindranath Tagore, shortly before his death, had graphically anticipated the conditions of India at the end of British rule. This is what Tagore says. The wheels of fate will someday compel the English to give up the Indian empire. What kind of India will they leave behind? What stark misery when the stream of their centuries' administration runs dry at last. What a waste of mud and filth will they leave behind them. The mud and filth left behind was a famine-ridden country. 3 million perished just 4 years before independence. It was a country where per capita income and food grain output was declining annually for 3 decades continuously before independence, where average life expectancy at independence was a shocking 30 years. People died on an average by the time they were 30. The poor died much earlier. On top of all this, the British left the country deeply divided on religious lines, with millions dead, and rendered homeless in a communal carnage that occurred under colonial tutelage. It was a gigantic task indeed to lift India out of this misery, following the path laid down by the freedom fighters in their imagination of independent India. It is to Nehru's credit that he evolved a multi-pronged strategy to lift India out of this morass, which in fact became an example for numerous other countries which gained independence from colonial rule. I seek to outline in this address how Nehru undertook this stupendous and in many respects historically, I emphasize, historically unique task of creating a modern democratic nation state in a plural society left deeply divided by the colonial state, of promoting modern industrialization within the parameters of democracy in a backward and colonially structured economy, of finding the balance between growth and equity in an impoverished, famine-ridden country, of empowering the people and yet expecting them to tighten their belt for the sake of the nation, of promoting the highest level of scientific education, a field left barren by the colonialists. In short, of unstructuring colonialism and bringing in rapid economic development, but doing it consensually, without the use of force, keeping what has been called the Nehruvian consensus intact in the critical formative years of the nation. A Herculean effort was needed to achieve this task, and Nehru rose to the occasion, putting everything he had in this effort. In the process, leaving behind a legacy not only for the Indian people, but for the peoples of the world oppressed by colonialism, who were striving to liberate themselves of their past, but in a humane and democratic manner. In the rest of the time I have, I will very briefly, I will not be reading out anything more, discuss what I do in the rest of the paper, and mention a few points on how he attempts to implement the various elements of the idea of India. Since the secular vision of idea of India was severely threatened at the birth of the independent Indian state itself, and is again today at the gravest risk with the rise of communalism, I begin in the next section, section 3, with the communal challenge. That is the longest section in my address. I show how the leaders of the Indian national movement, particularly Gandhiji and Nehru, dealt with the virtual Holocaust-like situation between 1946 and 48, which culminated with the murder of the Mahatma and the killings of lakhs of people and millions being made homeless. The leaders of the national movement, particularly Nehru and Gandhi, took on the communal challenge frontally and staked their lives to protect the minorities, in this case the Muslims, and thus democracy itself. They were not afraid of using the Muslim word, fearing that they will lose Hindu votes. They refused to allow India to become the mirror image of Muslim Pakistan, a Hindu Rashtra. In this section, I highlight, and this is what they did between the period 46 to 50. In this section, I highlight this aspect, what they did in this period and what we can learn from that, and some other lessons we can learn from Nehru, who had a deep understanding, probably the first to have a deep understanding of communalism in India. As early as the 1920s and 30s, he's writing about it, much before W.C. Smith and others in 1940s. First, just quick 5 points. First, Nehru emphasizes the need to oppose both minority and majority communalism. Lessons we can learn today, every political person can learn today. He warns that the response to one communalism cannot be the other communalism. As he put it, I'm quoting him, one communalism does not end the other. They feed on each other and they both fatten. Second, in relation to this, he says, in fact, these two communalisms, the minority and majority communalism, often cooperate with each other to keep the secular forces at bay. Witness the Muslim League and the Hindu Mahasabha joining hands in their opposition to the Indian National Congress. Secularism is their main opposition. The other communalism is not actually their main opposition. They actually even formed governments together, as you know, the Muslim League and Hindu Mahasabha. Third, Nehru warned that while minority communalism tends to be separatist, majority communalism can easily masquerade as nationalism, though in reality they are anti-national as it breaks the Indian nation. Now this is very important that he's telling you in the 1930s that majority communalism can easily masquerade as nationalism. As he puts it, Hindu nationalism is just another name for communalism. It is in reality anti-national and reactionary. During the national movement days, the word Hindu nationalism was not used. They were called communalists. It's a great pity that from journalists to academics, people have now started using the word that the Hindu communalists used for themselves. That is Hindu nationalist. How can you call anybody? It's a misnomer. It's a contradiction in terms. In a multi-religious country, if you're Hindu nationalist, you break the nation. You're anti-national. Fourth, Nehru was the first to warn of the fascist nature of communalism. Just as Amartya Sen in 1993 was the first to use the term communal fascism for the fascist forces in India. He repeatedly warned of the fascist nature of the Muslim League and the RSS. I'm quoting Nehru. He says, communalism is in fact the Indian version of fascism. And by following this path, he says, the ultimate result would be similar to what happened to Hitler and fascism in Europe. I do not want India to follow this terrible path. Wise words which we need to heed today. Fifth, Nehru emphasized that both the use of state power and an ideological battle is necessary to combat communalism. After banning the RSS and putting 20,000 RSS workers in jail following Gandhiji's murder, and after giving a complete drubbing to the communal parties in the first general election of India in 1951-52, all the communal parties put together could not get more than 10 seats. After doing that, Nehru has the following to say. He gives the following warning, which we must listen with great care. He says, winning an election, banning communal organizations, arresting a few